Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome along to our HERlarious virtual reality session. I'm Keith Crombie, Business Growth Enabler for the Royal Bank of Scotland, normally to be found out and about in East Lothian, Mid Lothian, and the Scottish borders, meeting people like yourself and finding out how the bank can help you grow your business. However, 2020 has been far from a normal year, so just like everyone else, I've had to adapt to continue to provide you with support. Welcome, therefore, to my living room. At the Royal Bank of Scotland, we want to be the bank of choice for women in business. In 2019, Alison Rose led the Rose Review into female entrepreneurship, commissioned by the Treasury, that showed that if women started and grew businesses at the same rate as men, it would add £250 billion to the UK economy. We're working on implementing the 8 recommendations from the Rose Review across the industry to help achieve that, and are pleased to be one of the founding members of the Investing in Women Code, alongside more than 60 other banks and financial institutions. Earlier this year, Alison Rose, the only female CEO of a high street UK bank, also announced our new purpose: to be the champion of UK business and be the biggest supporter of startups in the UK and Republic of Ireland by helping create 50,000 new businesses by 2023 and supporting 500,000 people on their journey. As part of that, we aim to make sure that 60% of that support goes toward women. And as part of that commitment, we will continue to organise events just like this to support women in business. Now, we know that this year has been very challenging for us all, with constant changing conditions due to COVID-19. Last year, we held a very interactive session in Edinburgh, and this year we've once again partnered with Funny Women to bring you skills and techniques from the world of stand-up comedy to help us all navigate through these uncertain times with greater resilience and some humour too. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Lynne Parker, founder and chief executive of Funny Women.
Thank you, Keith, for that wonderful welcome. And yeah, hark back to brilliant times last year. It's here we are in cyberspace, but let's make this a fun session. So without further ado, today's event is really all about strategies to help you thrive. That is in your workplace, which is most likely like Keith and I in our homes. I'm in the basement, he's in the lounge. I don't know what that says about us. And in your lives outside of work as well. Virtual reality is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. And no doubt it will continue to be a component of the way we work and communicate beyond lockdowns and the restrictions of social distancing. Now, we know this is hard for us all, particularly those of us in the entertainment industry, and also with the current lockdown and the continued uncertainty. The promise of a COVID vaccine is all very exciting, but things are not going to change overnight. So it's all about finding good strategies for getting the best out of life, both professionally and personally, right now, and not being open to what might develop in the future. And being open, sorry, not being open to what might develop in the future. Now, my personal view is that resilient people are adept at working with what they've got and very much in the moment. Planning is great and important, but what happens when it goes wrong? There has to be a backup plan, and even if you never use it. And without sounding like my hero Bear Grylls, those who survive are able to improvise, take quick and positive action, and think creatively about the situation they find themselves in. My own experience, just to kind of briefly put this in context, is that it is actually working in comedy that has taught me all about living in the moment, speaking up for myself, and sometimes, not always, not caring too much about what people think of me. Funny Women was born out of a very tricky situation when I worked as a publicist for a very misogynist comedy promoter, and that was 18 years ago. When I questioned this gentleman why he never booked any women for his club, he told me that women aren't funny and that there are no funny women. Well, I've spent 18 years proving him wrong. And I had previously been a journalist and marketing PR consultant. So although I'd come to comedy sideways, in my role now, I produce and I promote comedy entertainment. and very proud to have been doing so since 2002. Funny Women has become a nationwide and even global community, thanks to the pandemic, for women to perform, write and create comedy, with the Funny Women Awards at its heart. I'm really proud that we actually completed our 17th competition this year, despite restrictions of lockdown. And the work we do under our HERlarious banner came out of running workshops for our people that wanted to work in comedy. And we found that many tricks of the trade were interchangeable and can empower you in business as much as it does in our world of comedy. So today I'm joined by two brilliant women that I work with quite a lot. They're both comedians and advisors to Funny Women, Rachel Creeger and Jo Fletcher Cross. On the theme of resilience and creativity, I asked them both a little bit about the challenges of lockdown and life in general. Rachel told me that her biggest challenge during lockdown was not treating my family as either my audience or fellow comics. There she is. My teenager does not want to hear my top bants. We'll come to that, Rachel. And I asked her what she was most proud of, and indeed she should be, because she created an amazing chat show called Jew Talking to Me. It's a podcast with her co-host Philip Simon, and it's been a lockdown project that took on a life of its own. Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you, but Rachel, just so everyone knows, she's an award-winning comedian, director, writer and resident MC at London's When It's Open Pro Comedy Club upstairs at the Adam and Eve. More interestingly, I think, she is the only practicing Orthodox Jewish woman on the UK comedy circuit. And she's also, as well as her own podcast, she's a regular guest on BBC Radio London. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to talk to you about the pressure to perform when things get tough. Over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you for having me. This is lovely. I love doing this sort of thing. So those of you who saw the blurb for this event would have noticed that it mentioned in my bit about Shakespeare, because as someone who works in the arts, the issue that's kind of been brought up again and again and again during lockdown is how creative Shakespeare was when he experienced the same thing. So for those who aren't sure what I'm talking about, between 1603 and 1615, there was the bubonic plague rife across the country, and they worked out somehow that it was carried by rats, but it was spread by the close proximity of people. So they closed down all the theatres and the brothels for 78 months. So we think lockdown's been hard for however long we've been here, but imagine no theatres and no brothels for 78 months. Tough times. And during this quarantine isolation period, Shakespeare actually wrote King Lear, Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. So incredibly productive. But if you remember, the brothels were closed and he clearly had more time on his hands. Not only that, but it was unlikely he had to look after his kids, manage his household, try his best to get an online bookings for shopping. That has been virtually impossible for most of us. Can you imagine back in those days? And he certainly probably didn't have to do tax returns, all the other added pressure that we've all had to face during our experience. I mean, for me, this has been a bit like living in the Big Brother house, because obviously all my family have been at home, but apparently it's frowned upon to set them shopping tasks if you've got to feed them, and you're not supposed to vote them out for eviction. You have to hang on to them. But I think it's been very tough for those of us in terms of our business, where our work and our self-identity are very, very bound together. And particularly if your job is your career, and that's true whatever industry you work in. This is a time of furlough and redundancy and anxiety and uncertainty. And I think a lot of us feel extreme pressure to sort of prove our worth and to prove how valuable we are. And, you know, for example, actually, someone asked me, what's your biggest anxiety about what will happen with you and your role over this very complicated period when you're not really able to work? And I said, if I'm very honest, and bearing in mind Lynne's lovely introduction to me, it's that during this time, another practicing Orthodox Jewish woman will discover that she's funny, and she'll be able to tell jokes and take over from me, and my USP will be gone. What will happen? But I don't think it's an uncommon thing for everybody to be concerned about where their role will lead them and whether there'll still be a place for them after this very strange, very global experience. We also have a huge amount of pressure at the moment to learn and develop new skills. Now, it's obviously great to learn new skills, and it's a great benefit for you, I think, in whatever line of work you're in. But when your job was never designed for those skills, it can be very hard. So, for example, transferring everything to online platforms has been a very, very steep learning curve for lots of people. And even when there have been times when you've had to work from home in the past, you haven't had to think about Zoom or StreamYard or any of these platforms, for example. So it was never important, for example, when you were using Skype in a tiny space, that you had to think about how the rest of your living room looked in case people all around the world were going to be able to tune in and hear you talking about it. So we've had to develop skills that might not come naturally to us, like tidying my house. It might not come naturally to your line of work. And sometimes it feels like you're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And I think that's been very, very tough. So I tried to consider what skills people might need and what senses of resilience people might have and what tips I could give for dealing with that pressure that we have all the time to feel that we're actually functioning and we're working well during this very, very weird period of our lives. I was just thinking about my son who's doing GCSEs at the moment. And I said to him recently, you know, when you're older and you have your own kids and they're doing their GCSEs, they're going to ask you about this period of time because it will be on their syllabus because it's such a major historical event. And what are you going to be able to tell them? And he's going to say, he said, well, I'll tell them that I sat on my computer for 6 months and you brought me sandwiches. So that was very deep, but also quite grounding in terms of his perception of the fear that I feel when I look at the rest of the world. So here are my top tips for you. You don't have to do everything today. I have to keep telling myself that as well. You don't have to do everything today. The pressure to perform is constant, but when you were in your normal workplace from 9 to 5, you did a day's work and there was always stuff to carry on for the next day. It's like for us as comics, our work is never finished. Your joke is never fully written. It's something that you'll refine and refine and refine as time goes on. So it's good to just take a moment and think about the fact that never did we feel we had to get everything done just because the computer was here and we didn't have to go anywhere. So you don't have to do it all today. Leave yourself some work for tomorrow. That's fine. I hope I'm not going to get anyone in trouble with their management if they're also watching. My next tip is to find your tribe, and whether that's online or in real life in any way, it's really important to find people to connect to. This is a very isolating time. So finding people who share your interests, who share your humor, who you can connect to is absolutely vital for your mental health and to feel good and to be able to be the best you. If you're not stimulated, it's very hard to deliver your best self. So find people who share your passions, share your interests. You can do that through any number of platforms. And when lockdown restrictions are eased, maybe we'll be able to do that in real life again in some way. I think it's important as well to use the phone and even maybe use Skype and things like that, but to hear a real human voice in real time. So I feel that personally, we've all got very used to WhatsApping and messengering and whatever and emailing. And we don't do so much phoning of our friends and phoning of our family because we've got out of that habit. We lead such busy lives. We're always running around from here to there. I've suddenly found that I'm not running around from here to there, and I want to be in contact with the people that I love and that I miss. And when you speak to people on the phone, it makes a human connection. The instantaneous voice, knowing where they are, imagining them sitting on their chair talking to you while you're talking to them. It's a really humanizing feeling, and it will really give you a very big serotonin boost. Separate your workspace from your home space. That's really hard if your workspace is your home space, but give yourself like a little nook, which is where you work, and only be there as much as possible when you're working. So if you are in that space, you'll be in your zone. So much the same way as off stage and on stage, we're not always the same people. This is a great way of feeling that you're in your work mode when you're at your workstation, and then the rest of the time, your home is your home. it's so important, because it's really, really difficult to maintain a sense of who you are as yourself when your workplace becomes your living space at the same time. And also separate your working day from your home life. So give yourself a cutoff point. I'm the worst offender at this, so I hope you understand that I'm giving you advice that I find challenging to take myself. But that's quite important as well. Set yourself a cutoff point, and that's the end of your working day. And at that point, whether that's at 3 o'clock in the morning, if that's how you work, whether it's at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it doesn't matter. But switch off your laptop if you can. Switch off your work phone if you've got a separate work phone. And if that's allowed, and I'm not getting into any more trouble, because that separation will help you to regain yourself and sort of feed and nurture yourself, so that you'll be able to work well in your work time, but also have a bit of a life when it's not work. This is a very important bit of advice, and I hope you'll all take it very seriously. It's not compulsory to learn to bake sourdough, crochet, or to start your own podcast. It's not compulsory. You don't have to do it. I mean, do it if you want. Maybe not the podcast, leave some space for us, but you don't have to learn anything. You don't have to do what anyone else is doing. Do it if you want to do it. Do it if it excites you and interests you. We don't have to keep up with the Joneses. We have to remember that everything we see online about the brilliant things people are achieving is the edited highlights of their life, right? It's the edited footage. It's not the day to day. So, for example, I'm sitting here. I look very presentable, but obviously pajamas. And I've been sipping from my glass of water, except it's all gin. Nobody knows, do they? Nobody knows. So just don't worry about what you see. Don't worry about the pressure to perform in terms of the achievements. It doesn't matter if you haven't Marie Kondoed your house. It doesn't matter unless it matters to you. It doesn't matter if you haven't found an old wooden pallet at the end of your garden and turned it into an amazing playhouse for your children. Because I'm going to tell you a secret now. I think people are getting builders in for that stuff. I don't think they're really doing it themselves. Just don't worry about it. When you finish Netflix, like the whole of Netflix, watch nature. That's a big tip from me. Watch nature. It's free. It changes all the time. Just look outside your window, go for a walk, clear your head, get some headspace. It's amazing how much more productive you'll be, but without feeling that massive pressure, because walking and moving and seeing other things and getting wind in your hair or wind in my headscarf for me, that gives you the energy to feel that you can do your best things without feeling that you're under pressure to do them. And find something to laugh about would be my last tip, really. I think if you find things to laugh at every day, however bad things are, it really helps you to pull yourself together. So what I'm hoping is that we can take this pressure to perform away, because 99% of that pressure is in our own heads, and just try and get a little glimpse of all the positivity and the reality and the things that we can do for self-care that will enable us to kind of just put the right amount of pressure on to be our best us. So that's my bit.
Thank you. Virtual applause from and hopefully everybody else out there. Wonderful. I've heard Rachel share this wisdom previously, and it's just great. I always find something else to unpack and discover. There are, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat box on whatever form of communication that you are using. And a couple of questions have come through. There's sort of a thread here, Rachel. Okay. So one is, I wanted to ask you about very specifically that finding the, I think you kind of answered it, but that headspace, not necessarily the physical space, but that headspace. And you have kids. Mine have flown, but I still struggle with finding that headspace to really nail things down, to be creative. I always seem to not get to the personal creative project that I really want to achieve. Have you got any tips about that?
I mean, I think it's about prioritizing and treating it with the same respect that you treat the other things in your life. it's very difficult. I think particularly women, we often find that we put our needs and our wants and our creativity on the back burner to deal with all the practical stuff, deal with our work, deal with our family, deal with our home. I'm not saying that men don't do that as well, but I have never been a man, so I can only speak for myself. And so it's sometimes, I think you just have to decide, this is my time to do that thing. Set your side time and put it at the same level and the same goal. I mean, you kindly mentioned my podcast, You Talking to Me, and that my writing partner and I had talked about doing something like that for years. It was our late night Edinburgh Festival conversation over a drink for years. But being in lockdown, we realized we had to find something constructive to do with our times, and we put it as our 9-to-5 job. That was the only way to get it done. So that's what we've been doing. We've had a working week getting it off the ground, which has been great in terms of giving some structure. And I think at this very uncertain time, anything you do to put in structure is helpful. But also we prioritized it as something important for us, and it's allowed us to be creative and to put a framework around it. So I think if you're a stand-up, as you know, Lynne, then sometimes you get booked to do a show for a particular company, right? So you might get booked to do a corporate for RBS, and they say to you, we'd love it if there's some jokes about money and about mortgages and about loans. And so you go, okay. And then even if you've not had any material in your previous backpack about those subjects, you set yourself a time, you sit down, you do all the processes that you would normally do for writing jokes, like for me, writing jokes about chicken soup, and you'd write them about those things. So we have to apply that kind of work mentality to our creative time, to space for ourselves, to thinking time. Otherwise, it won't happen. It won't happen unless we make it happen.
A really good point. And there was a question about prioritizing, which seems to come up. And bear in mind that a lot of people watching this have day jobs. They're all busy. They're all doing their jobs, and they're going from their meetings on Zoom or whatever form it is. And then, you know, I would like to advocate for that creative space being quite important. I don't bake sourdough bread. I did write an article. I was so furious about everybody baking sourdough at the beginning of lockdown, first time around. And actually that became a bit of a metaphor for me for the whole of the rest of lockdown. But I do think that whole thing of prioritizing tasks, carving that little bit of me time, overused expression, but that, I think in the creative world, we do that quite well. And I would like to express the importance of a deadline. You know, again, if you work in a bank, presumably deadlines are pretty critical. But actually, you know, a deadline can be important for, I don't want to use losing weight as an example, but it's a good example, or writing your book, producing your podcast. You know, set yourself a deadline. I've learned, because I work remotely, my team is all remote. I've always done that. So, you know, now if you're used to working in an office and you're not used to setting your own deadlines, now's the time to do it. You know, create your own timetable. Let me just see. There are a couple of other questions coming through.
Whenever you mention deadlines, by the way, or anyone does, I always think of Douglas Adams, the writer, and his quote, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly past. But I think deadlines are important. I'm going to agree with you, with one caveat, that deadlines you set for yourself, if things come up, life things, be kind to yourself. I mean, be realistic. And also, even with work things, sometimes you just have to have a negotiation. And that doesn't mean put things off indefinitely, but sometimes you do, especially now, have to be able to negotiate with yourself about how to manage that.
And don't be frightened to move a deadline. You know, it's what you said very early on in your little presentation is about you don't have to do everything on your list. It's the same for a deadline. If you know you're not going to meet it, fess up. You know, I would much rather somebody tell me that they're not going to come in on a deadline than spend hours worrying about it, you know. And I think that's the thing we've got to learn about the virtual space. There's no room for maneuver here. This is it, you know, use it and communicate and tell people what you're doing, because we can't see you. You know, we can't see you you're not sitting across an office anymore. Right. Someone is asking, would you name your, this is a very specific bit of advice, more creative than it is to do with business, but we'll, I don't know, there might be a few business podcasts out there in development. Would you name your podcast in your own name or a stage name?
Well,
Interesting
I
one.
mean, it is interesting. I think it probably depends on what your podcast is about if you're doing it. So, for example, if you had a responsible job in the financial sector and your podcast was about something that perhaps your management might be a bit whatever about, then a stage name is probably quite helpful. I think mostly for people in the performing arts industry, you use your own name in whatever you can because you're trying to further your career. We called ours Jew Talking to Me because we thought it was funny, interesting, and because it's a chat show where Jews from the entertainment industry talk, so it made sense. I think naming anything, your book, your song, your sketch group, your podcast, it just needs to sell what it is that you're doing in a way that isn't going to get you fired. That's my advice.
I think that's very good advice. One more question, and then we're going to introduce Joe. So last question, which I think is a really good one because we all need a little bit of light relief. What are you watching and what are you listening to? What podcasts are inspiring you? What Netflix is floating your boat? What are you watching, Rachel?
So that is quite challenging. I'm watching TV that I'd be embarrassed to own up to, like really schlocky, terrible television. I've watched Married at First Sight from all countries. That's one example. I've been watching a lot of cooking. My son got married recently, so I watched a lot of wedding related shows and a lot of cooking related shows on television. But really, if it's to do with, and also Love After Lockup, which is embarrassingly terrible piece of television. But what am I listening to? There's a really interesting couple of comedy podcasts which I quite like, obviously apart from my own. But there's one called The Comedian's Comedian, and which is fantastic, which is Stuart Goldsmith's podcast, and he talks to different comedians about their process, and he's done about 500 episodes. So if there's comedians who you're interested in, there's loads of brilliant women in there, you can listen to that. And the other one is Mark Simmons' podcast, which I think is called Jokes with Mark Simmons. I'll double check it and see if I can put it in the chat. But in that podcast, he kind of works with different comedians. I'll fess up that I'm going to be on it at some future point later. But he talks to comedians about the jokes they've never got to work and sees if you can workshop it to make them work. And that's quite nice. And he recently had Adele Cliff on, who's fantastic one-liner. She's the current UK pun champion, and she's also Funny Women regular. So there are lots of great comedians to listen to on there analysing what's gone wrong, including actually Sarah Millican. There's a double episode of Sarah Millican talking about the lines she hasn't ever got to work in front of audiences, which is really interesting.
Well, I look forward to all my future exchanges with bank tellers having at least a pun or a joke in them. Put Keith to the test at the end of this session.
I want to put savings on it.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel. Stay around. We're going to come back and have a little joint discussion at the end. Thank you so much. Virtual applause. And I'm going to introduce the wonderful Jo Fletcher Cross. Where is she? It is. Hello, Jo. So when I asked Jo about her biggest challenge during lockdown, she said, "This is a good one, actually. I'm sure a lot will resonate. Losing my long commute. I don't mind wrestling with the vagaries of Greater Anglia every day, but I'm bereft at the loss of time to watch Gogglebox," continuing the theme, and all the rubbish telly that my husband doesn't let me watch or enjoy watching. Yeah, that's a mute point. Right, and Mrs. Writing and working on the train. Yeah, working. Yeah, maybe not. And the thing that she's most proud of, which is very relevant, and you should be proud, is being part of a research group on COVID testing. So Jo actually does a self-test every 2 weeks. She can now swab her tonsils like a pro without throwing up in the mirror. That is very impressive, I have to say. And you apparently threw up 3 times. Oh my goodness. Oh, and keeping her child alive. It's a pretty good achievement, isn't it, really? So more importantly, Jo is an amazing journalist, editor, playwright, and thoroughly funny stand-up comedian. A lot of the people in our community do lots of different things. But Jo is by day, and we borrowed her today, she's the editorial manager at an independent publishing house, and she's a content specialist. So she oversees more than 50 publications a year, as well as major events, awards, digital and video products. By night, she becomes this amazing stand-up performer and works all around the UK and overseas, and has even been to the prestigious Just for Laughs festival in Montreal. And she also delivers with us as well comedy and writing workshops. So Jo is going to talk to us about how you press mute when you need to scream. I'm sure this will resonate with an awful lot of us, Jo. So over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Then yes, by night I don't do anything at the moment. I just watch more TV. So my life revolves around comedy, travel and live events. So as you can imagine, it's been a fairly stressful year. Nothing that I do has been particularly successful this year in terms of getting out and doing stuff. But, you know, we go on, don't we? On top of that, I now work from home. So before this crisis, there were about 7% of the workforce in this country worked from home the whole time. And around 20% of us said we did it on occasion. That's why I worked from home every few days or so. At the moment, obviously we're in England, we're in a second lockdown, it's tears everywhere else. Around 60% of the adult workforce in the UK are working from home. That will shift around, but it looks like a lot of us are home for, you know, for the time to come. The latest government advice down here in England says that those who work from home should do so, and I know some tiers in Scotland say the same as well, in Wales. Many of us have been told we'll be working from home until at least next year. And even if you're not, you're going to be doing a whole lot of video calls from your office. So here we are. We have to get used to it, don't we? Those of us with kids, we have to deal with that too. It's obviously not quite as stressful as when we had 5 months of homeschooling early in the year, but there are occasional bouts of homeschooling when bubbles burst at school. And as you can see, this is not a lovely plush office space like I used to work in. It was very shiny and lovely. This is my stepdaughter's bedroom that I've appropriated. I think it's the only teenager's bedroom in the country where I've had to put up more fairy lights because it got really dark when the clocks changed. I was like, oh no, I need more light. This is horrible. So now it's all lit up like a bordello. On top of that, I've got a couple of idiot cats. I know some of you will have pets at home. My cat, one of them in particular, really likes to get in on video calls. And in fact, she's asleep next to me. And the only reason she hasn't come in yet is that she hasn't realised I'm on a call. So I'm sure she'll turn up at some point. So I'm sure, like a lot of you, if you weren't working from home 100% of the time, you will understand this. I sat at home for about a week just staring at my computer, still with deadlines, wondering how I was ever going to get anything done. And I have to say, in this second lockdown, it's been very similar. I had a real period of thinking, how do I do this? I'm in a job that requires constant communication. But apart from the odd connection disaster every now and again, it's actually been okay. And I've realised that what I did before lockdown, all the things that I have been trying to do, the comedy and talking and all these things, have been leading up to this time. They've prepared me in a really unique way to just get on and be okay. The thing that's staring us in the face in the way that it didn't before is literally our faces. Video calls force us to confront ourselves in a pretty stark way. Apparently, on lots of things, you can actually turn the view of yourself off, but I'm here to urge you not to do that. When I'm doing stand-up, I record all my gigs. Often it's the audio, but where I can, I'll video them. And it's really helpful. I watch them back the next day. And obviously, that is hideous. You think, why have I done that? Why am I doing that thing? But it's really helpful. You start to realize all the unconscious habits you have, the things that distract from your message. You get to see what works. If something connects with the audience, you can assess your whole performance. So was it the way I said it? What was I doing? Was it the line itself? Zoom calls, video calls can be like that too. You can see what you look like when you're talking, when you're presenting. Do you have habits that make you look less confident, less able? You'll see them, and it's horrible when you see them, but if you see them, you can change them if you want to. Watch yourself. Don't be afraid of it. That's what I say to you. Just look and think, how can I make myself better? I'd also say rehearse. Now, I would really like to be the kind of comedian who can step on stage and improvise for 20 minutes, but I'm not. I can riff off an idea when I get up there, but I need a structure. I need key lines that are committed to memory. That's really important to me. When I'm presenting an event at work, I know what I need to get across, why I need to get it across, and I go over it beforehand. You don't need to rehearse for every video call you have. That's ridiculous. You wouldn't do it for a regular meeting. But if you're not feeling confident about getting a point across in a meeting, write down those key points, open up Zoom or whatever video conferencing software you're going to use, and give it a go to yourself. You can usually just bring the video up, see what you look like, know what it feels like to say the things that you're going to say. Think about what kind of response you might get. Think about possible answers. Imagine the president in the West Wing when they rehearse him. That's what I do in my head. I think I'm very important. I am the president, the new president, and I rehearse your reactions to that. You might feel really stupid, but you'll feel worse if you don't get to put your point across. So give yourself a chance to do that. I also want to talk to you about organization. I am technologically adept. I don't have a problem with using technology, but I've found, particularly when everything else relies on technology at the moment, that I've become a bit more analog in the way that I organize myself. And I'd love to know if that's the case for other people too. I suddenly have a paper diary, although that didn't seem like a great investment at the start of the year. I am starting to use it again now. Things are going in it. I like to make, when I present a live event, in previous times, I would quite often use card rather than PowerPoint, or I'd use them in combination anyway, because that's just how I feel I work better. But the absolutely brilliant thing about working from home is that I can have those cards all over my desk. I don't have to pretend that I'm not using them or they're in my hand. I can just have them wherever I am. I had to present a live event for the company I work for not that long ago, which was for a very important client, and there was one particular phrase that they really didn't want us to use, so I had to just stick that everywhere. I had post-its all over my computer right next to me, practically on the cat, just saying don't do it. And it was constantly, I was a bit worried that it was going to be a Fawlty Towers don't mention the war moment, but it's okay. I didn't say it, so I would recommend that. I also, in terms of organizing my day, I know Rachel's talked about this a bit, and Lynne, I now have, I'm going to show you my whiteboard. Anyway, 10:45, that's us, 11:45, and I can't do without it now. I have to have it written in front of me, and I'd really recommend doing that as well. It's okay to do that. This is kind of how I work with comedy, but at some point I would move that into my head. But because we're here at home and nobody knows what's on my whiteboard, I can do it and just have it right there. I hesitate to talk about how we look because, Rachel's covered this as well. It doesn't really matter. I know it's tempting to sit around in your pajamas, and God, you should do it if you want to. It's fine. But if you're on show, if you've got something really important, you've got a meeting with a manager, with somebody about a loan, you want to talk about something really important, then I find it helpful to think about what I'm wearing, and not necessarily like I'm going to dress up and look really nice. But it's dangerous to say this because you're all going to look at me and think, what on earth is she wearing? But for instance, today I knew I was doing this, so I've put on my favorite tights. It's really pathetic to have favorite tights, but these are difficult times. And I know no one's going to see them because we don't have legs now in this Zoom era, but I feel good in them. It makes me feel good. And, if I could do the splits or something, I could show you, but I can't, and so I won't. But they're very nice. That kind of thing makes me feel a little bit more confident. And I really think it's worth thinking about things that will help you feel more confident. It's like you would do on stage. You would wear a great outfit that makes you feel that you can move around and have a good time. It's the same sitting here. Wear something you like. Wear something you feel confident in. Doesn't matter what it is. Backgrounds, there's a lot of talk about this. We've got some great backgrounds. You, of course, can now download the 4 Seasons total landscaping background, which I'm very tempted to do, but it doesn't always work. I've found that in presenting live events in particular, not just in meetings, people kind of want to see what your life is. We get a very unique insight into how people operate and how we work in a way that we wouldn't with an actual live event with us all there. So I think just embrace that. It's okay. I did an event for Spain a few months ago, and I was quite worried about it because they'd spent a huge amount of money and I was presenting it. And what I had done, I'm just going to move my screen slightly, was get a poster of Spain and some Spanish flags and just stuck them up with some blue tack. And I thought, well, that was a £5 well spent on eBay. And they really loved it. They loved it. We're just at home. We're doing our best. It's okay to show that, your cat is beside you. It's fine. Don't be worried about it. Try things out. If you think, oh, I want to present myself in a certain way, then give it a go and see if you like it. The one thing that I really want to get across to people is that it's really important that you remember that your skills are still your skills. You don't lose them. because you're at home. I know, like Rachel said, we're all supposed to be writing a novel or baking our sourdough. But if you haven't picked up lots of new skills, that's okay. But you still have the ones that you had before, and you've probably learned to adapt them and use them in ways that are unexpected. And you should be proud of that. If you're great at leading a meeting, you're still great at leading a meeting. If you're a warm and engaging presenter, you still are. If you're brilliant at listening and taking away notes and coming up with ideas, you still are. So whatever happens, you have to be you. And that's what I'd like you to take away from this. So yeah, that's all I have to say to you today, I think. Anybody, any questions? Lynne?
I'm going to come back in and pick up on a few things. Hello. Yeah, there was a couple of lovely comments. The bullet journals, that's an interesting one. I know one of my colleagues has a bullet journal. Don't quite know how they work, but actually, I'm big on the analog stuff. And my question was virtual diary or paper diary, Jo?
That's a good question. But when I was working in the office, I'd gotten very heavily into Trello and using virtual diaries. And I mean, it was really life-changing for me. I'd really got into it. But I found in that first period at home, I just couldn't bring myself to look at another screen for something. And that's why I got the whiteboard, you know, and now I've become, I don't know how it will change when we go back to, you know, if we go back to the office. Will it change? I'm not sure. But yeah, at the moment, paper diary.
I think some of the systems will remain. The other thing, just to remind that people on this today come from all kinds of business sectors. So some people will have small businesses. Some people here might be working for large organizations. And clearly, if you do work for a large organization, there might be systems in place that you are obligated to use. So I think the coloured pencils and the whiteboards and they're all great things for you to have to balance out how you deal with things personally, manage things personally. I was going to ask you to, because you do quite a lot of events, presumably now all like this. Have you got 2 or 3 really useful little tips for people that are nervous about coming on screen, you know, and doing this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did an event not that long ago where just before I went live hosting, the person who runs events with me was like, "Oh, we've got 1,000 registrations." And I was like, I don't, that's an awful lot. I was like, "Well, what does it matter? You can't see them." And I was like, "But I know they can see me." You know, so I don't know. And maybe don't involve yourself too much with the numbers. It doesn't really matter if you're talking to 1 person or 100 people. If you in the before times, if I did a comedy gig and 5 people turned up, I'd be, well, that would be a typical Tuesday night, frankly, but that would be like, oh, what a shame. But, you know, if you're in a room with 100 people, well, I mean, 100 silent people is bad, but 100 laughing people would be great. So that makes a big difference. Online, it doesn't really matter. You can see people commenting and feeding back, etc. But just, that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to practice, to literally rehearse on a video platform. It's just the same. So you're talking to yourself in your room or you're talking to 100 people. It doesn't really matter. I think just, you know, concentrate on yourself. Don't get too caught up in what you look like when you're actually presenting the event. It's really hard not to. But
you know, I think we've all become a bit obsessed. It's very difficult. And the point about clothing as well, I just want to come in on that because I personally, like you, I feel better if I wear something that I feel comfortable in. Like, I'm the shirt queen, you know, I have lots of shirts, always have done. So I use very much, but you know, I've just got fatter. So sometimes it's leggings, you know, with some track pants, but yeah, we'll you know, but feeling good and making sure that you feel as normal as you can, because it is difficult because you are looking at yourself, and I don't have any brilliant tips for that. I'd welcome them if anyone's got any suggestions, but yeah, it's kind of just get over it. you know, this is what we look like, isn't it, really, Joe?
Yeah. I mean, I bought a sequined catsuit just before lockdown.
I remember it. I remember it well.
For a show that I was supposed to be doing. I was doing my first solo show this year. That hasn't happened. But I have worn the sequined catsuit quite a few times. I was like, and I was genuinely gutted. I was like, I'm never going to get to wear this. No one's going to want to see it. And I'm like, do you know what? I'm just going to put it on. So, I wear it maybe once a month. So yeah, you can still wear sequins. Maybe that's an important thing to take away.
Yeah, wear sequins. I think that's a really important bit of advice. So I think it's time to bring back Rachel, because I wanted to ask something very specific, which I think is quite a good. There she is. So hello, welcome back. I wanted to, but I think I'm right in saying this, that we would normally, in normal times, and given that this is RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, we would have all been in Edinburgh this year. And I'm sure there are lots of other reference points which are similar to people in other industries. But for us, I'm just interested in how you, now looking back on not having had Edinburgh in a business context, how you have dealt with it, or, just some reflections on it, really.
It's such a strange thing, because this would have been my 10th active year at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is such a milestone. And it felt, this is going to sound so melodramatic and lovely, but it felt a bit like a bereavement not having it. It's part of my calendar. I plan for every year. I'm there for 4.5 weeks. I have the same flat now for the last few years. So I've got like another home. I'm engaged with the Edinburgh Jewish community. So I have another spiritual home as well as another practical home with my bed that I normally sleep in the summer. And on the one hand, I think it was wonderful for my family to have me here. And on the other hand, they'd had me here for the preceding 4 months. They would probably been quite glad to get rid of me for a few weeks. So from a business sense, it's quite a weird thing, because Edinburgh costs us a lot of money. And it's very rare. Like, I think most comics who break even feel they've had a massive achievement, because the cost of living there for a month is the most expensive time, producing your show, all the materials like the flyers or whatever, doing all the marketing, spending money on all the different people who are going to work for you, the venue, everything, it mounts up. So any year that if you make the smallest of profits, it's an award-winning moment, never mind the awards. So from a financial point of view, I think it's probably been quite good for all of us to have a year off of that. But it's also the marketplace and the showcase for our work. So not having that, I think, has been very, very challenging for, let's say, people like me who are not celebrity comedians who you see on the television all the time, but were working comedians, earning a living, paying our way. And I do a lot of touring, and my tour got cancelled and Edinburgh got cancelled. So I feel slightly like I've become invisible. And again, there are pros and cons of that, but financially it makes it very challenging unless you find a way of making your mark. And that's where, funny enough, the pressure to perform comes in, because you start thinking, how can I continue to be memorable enough that I will continue to be employed?
And diversifying. I'd be interested to know anyone watching this, if they are a retail shop owner, the ways they've adapted. Because I think in comedy, I think although we may internally not think we are, but people who work in comedy, the unifying trait is resilience. If you're not resilient, you get out of comedy. So I'm very interested to know how people working who maybe own shops or have some other business that has the same sort of public interface that we have is affected by it. Joe, you were planning the spangles and the sequins were all for Edinburgh, weren't they?
Yeah,
this is your moment.
It was my moment. But, I've taken my moment in other ways. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. I was thinking of it from a business point of view, because I think it translates really directly into other businesses. I mean, whatever you're doing, I mean, lots of businesses will, there'll be a season where they go to a trade fair. There's all these things that suddenly you can't do physically, and we have to think about how do you practically show off what you do? It doesn't matter whether you're a comedian or you make greetings cards or, you sell travel. You still have to think about how you get across to people. And we've had to be very innovative. Those who have been particularly innovative and have come up with interesting ideas to transfer onto an online sphere are the ones who have survived. It will be interesting to see how that works going forward, I think.
And funnily enough, my husband works in the ethics and compliance industry, and his company moved everybody online very early. They're an American company, so very risk averse, as they should be. And but they found, for example, that of course their carbon footprint has gone down massively because of people not traveling to and from work, and also that people are much more efficient if they haven't had to travel, because they're where they work is in a big industrial site, so everyone has to travel in. So people who haven't had a horrible journey are way better at doing their jobs. You know, they just get on with it and and you're fresh when you start your day.
I mean, it's obvious what Funny Women is doing, and we're doing a lot of the things we would normally have done live like this in the virtual space. So, and we pivoted very early on. But, you know, out of interest, Joe, what do you think will stay? I noticed when we came out of the last lockdown, there was definitely a Zoom fatigue, very overused expression, but people suddenly were like, oh, we can go out now. We're not going to meet once a week on Zoom. You know, things start to change. What are the best bits? What can we take forward when life comes back to normal? What are the bits that you think will stay?
What I think will stay is, I mean, we might not all still be working from home, but unnecessary business travel. And that obviously has ramifications for all sorts of other businesses. So we have to be careful how we think about that. But people won't be just jetting off for meetings. It's so much more efficient to do a video call. It's incredibly efficient. And I think lots of people have been wise to that for a while. But, you know, you get CEOs, etc., who like to jet around the world, and we won't do that anymore. Some things, that will stay. And I mean, what we've seen is that consumers are much more interested in things being ecologically sound, and that's going to be really important. Anything that's brought that forward will be important. It's also important to remember that being online all the time isn't particularly ecologically sound either. So, you know, I think we're just we should be, and hopefully are, you know, consumer research shows that we are becoming more aware of our literal environment, not just the room that we're in, but the environment, biodiversity, etc. That will be more important in decision-making processes. And I think things that are good for that will stay.
I'd like to bring Keith back in, actually, because I know he... hello, Keith.
Hello.
Just while we're talking very much about this business environment, what have you noticed amongst your own customers' needs? Are there any particular things that have come up time and time again that are, other than the obvious things, that you've noticed are definitely challenging, or the kind of advice you get asked? Can you comment on that at all?
Yes, certainly. I think, you know, one of the main issues that customers have had this year has been the uncertainty, because we're all living in various different stages of lockdown. Probably everybody on the call is in a different stage. Obviously, England's in full lockdown. Scotland, we have different tiers. And it's been the uncertainty and the planning forward that's been the biggest challenge for customers. Quite a number of businesses have actually pivoted their offering. So they've looked at what they've done traditionally, and similar to what Rachel was saying, you know, you can't do what you've always done this year. So you need to adapt, and you need to adapt and change very, very quickly. So the very agile businesses have been able to do that and keep themselves afloat, but they're not done yet. You know, they're still constantly changing. And I think going forward, some businesses won't go back to doing what they did, because they've actually found new and more efficient ways to work. And also, we just touched on it there, very, very important now, greener ways to work as well. You know, if there's any good that can come out of this, I think a lot of businesses are now focusing more on local suppliers, local customers, and are not, you know, transporting goods the length and breadth of the country and beyond. So I think that's one of the big learning processes that a lot of our customers have gone through. One thing I'd like to ask the panel, if I may, in a world of back-to-back Zoom calls, etc., how do you stay focused? If you're doing 2 or 3 Zoom calls in a row, it can be, and I know this personally, it can be very challenging to stay focused, to not look out the window. And I think Joe touched on it earlier on, to write down your key points to make sure you don't forget them when you get them across. How do the panel cope with back-to-back calls and staying focused?
Okay, let me ask Rachel that question, because this came up fairly recently in something else we did. But Rachel.
I mean, I am quite lucky in that that doesn't often happen for me because I don't have a grown-up's job. But I mean, it's you just have to do whatever you can do in between. Just take that 5 minutes. We were talking about how we did something recently, and they booked in coffee breaks and whatever through, even though it was online. And I think it's quite important, if it looks like you're going to have a back-to-back meeting, try and make sure that it finishes with 5 minutes for a quick wee and a cup of tea. It's so important, because otherwise I think it is impossible to stay fresh staring at a screen the whole day. I mean, it's hard to do that in real life as well. Like if you are in a meeting room, it's so intense, having different people come in and out. Think of days when you've done interviews or whatever. That's really, really tough. So factor in your tiny breaks and use them as real breaks. Don't check your phone. Don't do another screen. Go outside and breathe for 5 minutes.
Jo?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, don't go to another screen. God, it's so hard not to do that. I also, I mean, obviously it depends who those back-to-back meetings are with. But for instance, this afternoon I've got 4 in a row with no breaks in between. But they are with people that I work with and know. And I think we've all gotten quite good at just being honest. There's no point in being like, yes, I definitely am on top of everything and I know what I'm doing. If your attention's flagging, just going, do you know what? It's 3 o'clock. It's really dark. I'm tired. You know, can we stop for a second? Can I get a cup of tea? Can we just, starting off the meeting with a little chat about something personal like you would in real life, I think is really important. I've noticed it with the younger colleagues that I have as well, who are just, I've got a house and kids and cats. They've got 1 room and 7 horrible flatmates. They are desperate for human connection. And I think that's what we are getting better at, I hope, is just going, this is horrible. Are we okay? And just taking the time to do that, I think, is really important.
I've got one more question and then we have to wrap, but it's a good question. What are your top tips for getting motivated to work on screen? If you normally, I think you've kind of answered this, Jo, but if you normally get your motivation from seeing others in person, just a quick 1-line response. No pressure.
Just be human with people. It's okay. We're in our bedrooms. It's all right to say, this is really difficult. Are you having fun? What's a nice thing that's happening? And you don't have to be corporate all the time.
Jo, Rachel.
I always try to take the options where you can actually see people, like whether that's Zoom or Skype or whatever. I try to avoid being the full screen when there's other people, and sometimes put a little post-it note over my own face, because then you remember that there might be a screen in between, but there are actual people there. Like, it is an interaction, even if it's online. So I just have to remember that this is still person to person, even though there's the filter of your machine in between.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good place to end. And my only other thing to add to that is, if you're in the room, whether it's a virtual room or a real room, be in the room. Don't, unless you need a pee or you want to go make a cup of coffee, have your face up there, let people see you, because actually, as comedians and performers, we like to know you're there. So that I'd like to end on that note. So thank you. I'm going to hand back to Keith to finish today.
Thank you very much indeed, Lynne, and thank you to Rachel and Jo as well for their input. Some really fascinating hints, tips and stories we've had this afternoon, so thank you all for that. I'm off now to try and get myself a sequined catsuit. Apparently that's the essential item. We'll get that on the Christmas list, so we'll see what we can do for next year for that one. But thank you to everybody who has joined us over various channels today. I hope you found it enjoyable and also informative as well. If there's anything you would like to give us feedback on, or any other ideas for future sessions, please do drop me an email. It's keith.crombie@rbs.co.uk. I'll pop an email out just thanking everybody for their attendance. And all it remains for me to do is to thank Lynne, Rachel, Jo, and all our technical people behind the scenes as well for making this happen. Have a good day, stay safe, and keep busy.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.